Welcome back to part 2 of the lab. Today we're going to be diving into card grading. Why you would do it, with whom thou shalt do it with. A lot of controversy there. And giving you guys just my sort of idea and theory behind grading cards, why you would or wouldn't grade a card, etc. Answering all of your collector questions, concerns, woes, thoughts, hopefully giving you some tips and information that you haven't heard of yet. Now, my goal with this video is to help you understand what grading a card does for the card, for you. Try to avoid you spending money on grading cards that won't pay off for you. Give you a little bit of my game theory, if you will, as to why I send certain cards and I keep my gem mint 10 rate above 75% on the cards that I do send. First, let's start with grading and why you would get a card graded in the first place, okay? Number one being encapsulation and protection, right? Let's imagine a world where you have a card that from the 1950s, and every year that goes by that card isn't in a slab or protected, its wear and tear gets worse, the damage could possibly get worse. Grading the card encapsulates it. It surrounds it with plastic or another material that another grading service might use, and essentially protects that card from future damage, encapsulating it and preserving it in its current state. That's one of the purposes that grading serves, but the second one is to actually get the grade, right? To get the grade of the card, figure out what standard it is with compared to a perfect card or a card that is exactly the opposite of perfect. Whenever a card is encapsulated like that, it's essentially frozen in time as that specific card. And knowing with a registry that that card exists, or the pop count, which is the population amount of cards of that exact style, type, parallel, variety in the exact same grade, to figure out how frequent was this card printed, how much of it's out in the marketplace, which inherently is going to drive value over time. Now, with most companies, you get both of those in the same fell swoop. You get your card graded and you also get your card encapsulated. Some companies charge more for grading an auto on a card or just encapsulating the card. If it's a card that you know is not going to be graded well, you can get a card authenticated if you want, which is just going to say, hey, yeah, this is that card, that one of one card, if for some reason the grade is not going to turn out well. Now, you've probably heard of most of the card brands in the space that are going to be doing the grading and authenticating. PSA. We're talking about SGC. We're talking about Beckett, BGS. We're talking about CGC. We're talking about CSG. We're talking about other companies like Tag and Rare Edition who are kind of new in the marketplace. There are constantly new players coming into the grading space, but you really have those top three that have sort of maintained their position at the top. We're going to focus in on specifically PSA because that is the typical industry leader when it comes to resale value on your cards, but not always, in my opinion, the best choice for encapsulating your PC long-term. Things to consider when grading your card and deciding where you want to send it, right? Assume it's a perfect card, absolutely gem mint across the board. Where are you going to send it, right? PSA is the leader in market resale value. There are a multitude of reasons why. That in itself is another video. But right now, the trend is if your card is a PSA 10, it is worth more in that 10 than it is for every other card brand on the marketplace, except for Beckett, which has a unique 10 label. It's called a black label. It's essentially an even more perfect version historically than the PSA 10s are, right? Very difficult to get in the grading scale. Beckett 10s do not match up, that are not black label, do not match up with PSA 10s. There's a value discrepancy there, right? So you really want to decide, why am I sending this card in to get graded? Is it for me? Is it for my personal collection, my PC, as people in the hobby like to say? Or is this a card that I'm trying to maximize my resale value on and get a return on my investment on the card? Let's talk about grading itself. What makes a 10 different from a 9, so on and so forth. It's going to vary by company, and it is somewhat subjective depending on who's grading your cards, right? There's an idea in the marketplace that if you have a card that gets a 7 or an 8, maybe you send it back, and if there's no noticeable damage, it gets a 9, or maybe even in some strange situation, a 10. The value of a PSA 9 is about the same as the raw card value, right? If it costs you $25 to grade the card, and the value, if it gets a 9, is the same as what you paid for the card, you have lost $25 in the process, right? So let's look at PSA specifically. Attributes include 4 perfectly sharp corners, sharp focus, and full original gloss. A PSA 10 card must be free of staining of any kind, but an allowance may be made for slight printing imperfection if it doesn't impair the overall appeal of the card. Which means, to me, in the print line, something like that, a manufacturer error, a small centering issue, if it's not noticeable to the naked eye, or you have to really look to find it, doesn't mean you're not going to be able to still get a 10 on that card. Now let's look at what 9 says, because that's the step down below Gem Men 10. 9 is our equitable to raw value in most situations, right? So 9, if we're getting a 9 back, we've essentially lost. We've lost the value on what we were hoping to get in grading. And let's look at what PSA says about the 9 specifically. PSA 9 is a superb condition card that exhibits one of the following minor flaws. Very slight wax stain on reverse, minor printing imperfection, or slightly off-white borders. When you are measuring your card, centering is the first thing I go to, but it's not the end-all be-all when it comes to whether or not I'm going to send a card. Knowing that grading scale, it gives us a couple options to check on the card itself, right? We're going to check for a few things. We're going to check centering, right? Which they gave us a really, really clear ideology around what could possibly 10, what could possibly 9. We're going to look at the surface, right? Front and back of the card. They gave us some clear imagery on what they're going to look for in that. Edges and corners are probably the most crucial mistakes that people make when it comes to sending cards in. If you have a ding on your edge or on your corner, that thing is not going to 10. Edges and corners are some of the most hurtful dings on you in the process of grading cards, right? So you're going to look for those 4 things when you're looking at your card. Surface, centering, edges, corners, right? If you check out on all 4 of those and there's not one of those 4 that gives you some sort of hesitancy to send the card in, slam that thing in an envelope and send it off. But if you do find some slight imperfection on the card, for me personally, that is a card that I do not send in because it is not typically worth the value of what you get if you get a 9. Even if you had the perfect card, it doesn't always make sense to grade it, right? Let's take a look specifically at this Will Levis Blue Scope Optic preview, right? This is a sick card. I picked one of these up recently for like 25 bucks at a card show. I'm trying to decide whether I want to send this card in to grade. I do that by doing a few things. I'm going to check the comps on the card value raw, which ideally you've done before you purchase the card. But I can use a few tools like Sports Card Investor. I can use 130 Point. You can use eBay, most recent sales. A lot of ways you can find the value of a card. These are some examples. And if you haven't looked these up, put them in your toolkit. They're all absolutely useful. But I'm going to look up the value of the card raw. And then I'm going to go look up the value of the card in a PSA 9 slab, which you can see I did here on 130 Point. And then lastly, I'm going to look up the value of the card with a PSA 10. The value of the raw card between 25, 30, 35 bucks. The value of the PSA 9 slab, 35 bucks, right? No net gain there if it comes back a 9. So if this card is not absolutely flawless in every single aspect and regard, I'm probably not going to send it in. Looking at the PSA 10 slabs, even if it was absolutely perfect, right? These things are selling for 80, 85 bucks. That means at most, I tend to gain in this situation, given shipping fees, insurance on sending in the PSA package, the actual cost of grading if I'm not a Collectors Club member. My net gain is going to be 20 to 25 bucks if I were to sell this card tomorrow and it came back graded today. It's going to be a month from now. A lot of variables and time with the process of sending cards in, obviously. If it's something for you, for your PC, check out other graders, right? I personally put all my stuff that I want slabbed for myself in Rare Edition slabs. Love the team at Rare Edition, love the slabs. Feels like I'm holding something valuable, right? But if I want to get something for max value on the resale market, throw it in a PSA, baby, send it on its way. Now, grading times depend on the company, depends on the season, depends on the sport. And my focus is mainly football, so obviously that's most of the examples that I use today. But I think generally speaking, whenever you're looking over your cards, making an assessment on the time of year that you're in right now is a big part of the decision-making process as well, right? Think about where we're at for football. 2 weeks, we've got the NFL draft. A lot of things are going to change between now and then. I'm not taking players like Will Levis or Rashee Rice or Quentin Johnston and sending their cards off to PSA today because a lot could change for them in 2 or 3 weeks. I am still sending off my Burrows. I am still sending off my Hurtses. I am still sending off my CD Lambs, right? All of those established players, doesn't really matter what time of year, but when it comes to young players and trying to play that market, it does tend to be a little bit more fickle on a week-to-week basis, specifically with what news is out in the NFL ecosystem. Do some research on the other companies out there. Grading is a completely subjective preference, right? So in a case where you're keeping the card, it's all about you, baby. But in a case where you're selling the card, it's all about that buyer, baby. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you learned something. Give us a follow if you're not following already, and stay tuned for the lab part 3.